Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, Stef.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
Doing all right.
I just had that, do you know that Friends episode where Rachel and Ross are drunk in Vegas and Joey's like, goes to Rachel, how you doing? She goes, I'm doing just fine, baby. How you doing? That's what came into my head when you asked me.
You can go right ahead and say that if you want. The Friends reruns have been on a lot lately, I've noticed. So I'm remembering a lot of those episodes. I mean, I left them in the 90s.
Right.
I'm doing all right, baby. No, we're here today to talk about how do I talk to loved ones about this, whether that's binge eating or disordered eating and not dieting anymore. And I think that the conversation will vary depending on who we're talking to, and we can certainly get into that. But this one is a good topic, I think, for not only listeners, but for people who are supporting listeners. I know that I used to just want to like play one for my mom, like, here, this is what I need. I can't talk about it anymore. So yeah, did you have conversations with specific people in your life around this, or was it something that people just sort of knew?
No and no. This is it. I didn't speak to my family about it. I didn't really speak to my friends much about it. I spoke to them at times. So near the beginning and early on with my binge eating struggle, I told people about it and I talked about it with those close to me. And then it became one of those things that it was almost like that was just who I was now.
Yeah.
And that was the point when I stopped talking to people about it. I was very conscious of not wanting to be repetitive, or I felt like I was going to be boring people, or like that they would get, sympathy fatigue if I just kept talking about it. So I stopped talking about it. So I think probably that a lot of my family and friends would have assumed that I recovered earlier than I did because I stopped talking about it. I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about this subject, but I'm afraid I don't have this great story of, no, nobody asked, Stef.
That was a sad face.
Yeah, I know.
Huh. So then you just became a binge eating therapist, and that's how people learned about your story after that?
I guess so. Yeah. Well, I don't even know if they still have, to be honest. I genuinely, I'm thinking now about some of my closest friends, and I've never actually had the conversation about how I recovered or what I did. And they haven't asked. But that's okay, because I stopped talking about it. So I don't think that they would have felt like they could have just asked me. So I think they felt like I'd recovered maybe a while ago and that everything was fine. And when I said I was going to be a binge eating therapist, they probably thought, oh yeah, that makes sense because you struggled with that a long time ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a similar situation in that this isn't something I talk about with people closest to me, except for my husband. But otherwise, it's sort of like it's a topic we really dance around. And I know that some of my friends have learned a lot more about it by reading my posts and getting my weekly emails. And there is this sort of like kinship there. I mean, I'll send out an email and I'll get like heart messages back, sometimes when I tell an old story. And it's not something we talk about necessarily in person, but there's other people who we just don't go there. I don't think they read my stuff. I don't think they want to. I don't think I want them to. And it's interesting because some of those people were people I did really talk about my binge eating to when I was in the thick of it. But it's just been an interesting thing about recovery in that we don't really necessarily talk about that so much. And it's also interesting because I think people assumed that I had recovered when I was still quite sick, more into the orthorexia. That was sort of like, again, to your point, when people may think that you're doing well because you're now eating healthy, and that's part of what people think that's a good thing. And so I think that can feel even more, for me, it felt more difficult because when I was embracing this clean eating lifestyle and like shouting it from the rooftops, I felt like a fraud because I felt like I knew that I was binging and I thought everyone else thought I was recovered. I suppose like going back to when you began binge eating? Was it something that you shared with anyone right away, or was it something you kept secret or kept, was it did it feel private at the time?
No, immediately I was talking to everybody about it, because I can tell you the exact week it started as well.
Mhm.
And I talked to my family, I talked to friends, I talked to my poor long-suffering colleagues about it
Mm.
because I couldn't understand what this was. It just confused me at the beginning. It wasn't even a shame thing at the start. I was just baffled by it. I was like, why on earth am I doing this? This doesn't even make any sense. And it was only as time went on and the harder and harder I tried to stop and the more weight that I gained, that I became quieter and quieter about the subject. But at the beginning, I talked about it a lot. And then probably for a number of years, I would still talk about it with those closest to me. I think what the timing was, I used to talk about it a lot in terms of how distressed I was about my weight gain.
Yep.
So it was
Yep.
very weight focused.
Mhm.
Once I'd made the decision to take the focus off of weight, I stopped talking about just the eating with those people in my life. And I wasn't living with anybody either. So that's the difference. I think it would be quite difficult to be living with somebody, a
Mhm.
significant person, as opposed to flatmates or something, and not have these conversations. So to some degree, I felt like my eating didn't impact anybody else, and it didn't. So therefore, there was nobody that it felt important to let in to
Yeah.
that as such. I think if
Mm.
someone had asked me, I would have been, it wasn't this conscious choice of, oh, I can't talk about it, or oh, I don't want to talk about it. I just stopped initiating conversations about it, and others didn't initiate it with me, which I get because it's
Yeah.
one of those subjects that I don't know that people
Sure.
feel comfortable bringing up.
Sure. I remember when I started binging, I didn't call it that though. I was young. I was a teenager and I was coming out of an anorexic pattern, or time period. And everyone was just happy that I was eating. And I remember I started binging, but didn't call it that. I think I used to tell my mom. I did. I mean, she was the first person that I told it to. And it was more of a, I'm suffering still, and you think I'm better, but you're not. Like, they were just so happy I was eating, and I said, "Mom, I eat so much." That's all I would say. "I eat so much." "No, you don't. No, you don't." "What is so much?" Like, because
Mhm.
my so much before used to be, she was doubting that. And I said, "Mom, I eat so much. You look great now," because I gained weight and I was, just and because I looked, back to my sort of stable weight up until that episode of my life, um, it was just sort of like, "You're fine. You're just being dramatic about your weight again." And I
Mhm.
was like, "No, no, no." And I was distraught about the weight. And that was a lot of why I was talking about it, because that's why I wanted to stop. It was more like, I need to stop gaining this weight, because I knew that I was just going to keep gaining it, because I knew I had no control over what was happening. But everyone else and my dad got in on it too and just said, enough now with this eating stuff. Enough, enough, So I felt like I was trying to communicate that I was in distress. And I also paired it with my depression, because I was also very depressed at that time. I was becoming more and more depressed. And so I talked about it as a system. It was like, I don't feel good. I feel unhappy and I'm eating a lot. But there was no other language around it. And I went off to college and I kept telling my parents, I'm eating a lot. I'm eating a lot. And it was still just sort of like, okay, okay, it's Steph saying her thing. And my sophomore year of college, I got to the point where my parents went away. My dad had a business trip in California. I think they were in San Francisco. And I was in my dorm room, and it was like the first semester of sophomore year, and I had just binged. I had just stolen roommates' food, and I was in my bed, unable to move. I didn't go to class. Everyone was at class. I was just me, and I remember feeling such disgust and despair. And I called my dean and I said, I need to check out of school. When can I make a meeting with you?" I went to the meeting. By the time my parents got home from California, I was home and I was checked out of school. I did it myself.
Wow.
And my parents were like, "What? Like, what is going on?" And I said, "I need help. Like, I am not well." And that's when I started getting treatment. Because up until that point, I felt like I had to do something really drastic to be taken seriously, and not to my parents. I mean, I think it just speaks to the time. There was really no awareness of this. And also, they were just happy that I wasn't under quote underweight anymore. This was me being better. And it was just sort of my silly little hang up about weight. At that point, I think that's how it was viewed. And nobody talked about binge. Nobody talked. I think there's people in my family, older generations that were actually binge eating. But it wasn't something that was talked about at all. And so that was me just sort of like, I don't know what else to do here except check myself out of school. Or can you take me seriously now? And then, that was how my parents really like started understanding this on a different level and how they knew, but it was a grand gesture of having to spell it out like that.
Yeah. It really speaks to trying to communicate the distress, right?
Yeah.
And how with words alone, sometimes it's really difficult to get the person to appreciate what it is, like the level of distress.
Yeah, exactly.
I was interviewed recently by another therapist, and she'd gone through a few eating disorders. One of the first things she said to me, I'd only just met her, about binge eating, she goes, "Oh, it's very glamorized." And I was like, I was like, "What are you talking about? It's glamorized. Like, it's the most misunderstood." And she was like, "No, but when I was struggling with binge eating, everyone was like, 'Gosh, that's amazing that you can eat so much and still look the way that you do.'"
Oh.
And she couldn't get anybody to hear and understand how distressing this was because of how she looked. So I feel there are two main ways that binge eating gets dismissed. One, if you are in a straight-sized or smaller body, it is this whole, well, you're just lucky that you can eat that much and still be in that size body. And if you're in a larger body, it's about willpower and discipline.
Yes. I have something somebody said to me once that haunts me, like just the way it was said to me and how much it minimized. I remember at some point this was further in. I had received treatment. I was receiving treatment and I still was binging. And I was talking about it. And this person said to me, "You just can't accept that you're fat." And I was like, I mean, it took my entire struggle and was like, and made it this big and made it like it was,
Vanity.
just a vanity issue or or it was actually meant to a willpower. The way that it was said was about like, you just don't have the willpower and you can't deal with that, which is I mean, how many times I hear this as an inherited narrative that the insecurity around binge eating is that story generally a lot of the time. And the person who said this to me has also internalized that. But when it came to me and somebody spoke what I had really been thinking about myself, I was gutted. I was like, I just felt like it invalidated my entire, and I carried that with me until I recovered. I really felt like that was the truth of it and I couldn't face it. And that was what people really thought. And that's when I stopped talking to people about it because I was like, this is what people think. People aren't seeing what I'm going through. They're just, I'm pitiful. Like that's just how I saw it after that. And that was someone really close to me. And so after that, I only spoke about it to my mother. And there were some friends who understood it as well and who were very interested in supporting me. But that was it. After that, I sort of saw it in a different light because up until that point, I had been clinging on to my eating disorder. I said eating disorder, and even after naming it binge eating and having been diagnosed, I called it an eating disorder because the word binge I didn't like. I wanted people to know that like I have an eating disorder. It was more like, yes, I starved for a period of time. I was very, very thin. And when I heard this statement, it was like, that's how people see what I'm going through is like me just not having enough willpower. It's not an eating disorder.
Wow. So when you said there were a few people that understood, is there a nuance here between understanding what you were going through and accepting what you were going through?
Yeah, sorry. Nobody understood, but I did have friends who wanted to understand and who asked me about it regularly and checked in with me regularly. And it was a topic of conversation in general. But no, nobody understood. And that was the loneliest part. Yeah.
And that feels like an important part to think about when we're talking about sharing this with somebody who's close to us and what is it we hope to get from talking to them about it, because it's often I want them to understand. And I think I mentioned this the other week in the podcast because we touched on this subject then, but I don't know. I couldn't understand unless I'd been through it. I don't understand what it feels like to be a trans person, but I totally accept that somebody's experience. And I think there's a nuance there, and there's almost I don't know if grief, there's some sadness about accepting that there are going to be people very close to you who can never fully understand this, which is why spaces like ours are so important. Come and join us on Patreon.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say, yes, exactly that. Because when I was able to finally communicate with people in treatment groups that I ended up joining, um, it was like, oh gosh, just being able to talk to someone who could speak my language. It felt like there was a bond there almost immediately. And gosh, I could just sigh with relief thinking about it, because nobody else, yeah, as much as the love is coming forth or the support, even when I would speak to my husband about it later on, he was very much supportive and there for me, but I knew he was never going to get it. I knew that he was never going to get it. And to speak to people who get it is, I think, in all walks of life, whatever it is you're going through, when someone else has been through something like that, that community is so important. And I think that's something that, again, that's why we do this. That's part of the healing process, I think, is knowing that there's other people that see you.
So I would say to the person communicating to the loved one and the loved one on the other side of it is I feel like almost both sides have to, sounds a bit black or white, doesn't it? But it would be beneficial for both sides to accept that the other person isn't going to be able to fully understand it, because I also think that loved ones can get frustrated because they don't understand. Whereas if we start from the premise of you're not going to be able to fully understand at the visceral level what this is like, I feel like accepting that as a basic premise is actually helpful. Because if you just get frustrated for not understanding, that's when you're likely to be more dismissive. When you accept and appreciate, I'm not going to be able to fully understand this, but let me understand and accept what I can. And what do I need to know to be here for you? That feels like an important piece to mention.
Yes. This brought up for me the idea, I think sometimes that feedback of you're doing this to yourself or you're not trying to help yourself. I think that for someone who doesn't understand the powerlessness of this, it can be really frustrating as like, why do you keep doing the thing that keeps putting you in such distress? Like it doesn't compute to someone who doesn't have that instinct and urge. And I can relate to that even now, as when I'm not experiencing binge urges like anymore. So it feels, I can like, oh, this is what people felt like when they were looking at me like, why are you doing that? Because I'm not having the urge anymore. So you can't understand why one would be compelled to do it, keep doing it. It seems so much easier when you're not having a binge urge. I can't look at this from my perspective and assume that that's their perspective. What they're dealing with is something that I'm not able to quite understand, but I have to trust that it's there. That this isn't them just self-sabotaging on purpose, And then that brings up the point of what are we looking for? What do we need from people? And I think sometimes the tendency for someone to want to fix a problem is the urge of the supporter's role. I know that my mom and my husband and my friends, they just kept offering their advice as to what I should do and what I should do. And it felt like, it was like, okay, yeah, but I mean, really, when someone gives you their advice, you're like, you obviously do not know what this is like. And that's frustrating because that comes very much through when you're given advice to just stop or to just take a bath or just whatever. Think of it like this. And so part of that supportive role is just being a shame-free listener, just being a non-judgmental space to be able to hear it. You don't have to give back. You don't have to, at least in my experience, I didn't need anyone to tell me what to do, although I did ask. I was like, what do I do? What do I do? I did ask quite a bit. But really, none of the answers were ever met with any sort of, I was like, oh, you don't even know. You don't even get it. But it was important for me to just know there was a place for me to go. There was a place for me to put my distress, and that someone would just be there to listen to that and not try to fix it.
And to acknowledge how hard that would be for the supporter to do. It's not easy to watch somebody you care about struggling with something that seems so self-sabotaging, so self-destructive, because you've probably seen them when they're distressed or even when they're excited about having found something new and they're going to fix it and they're going to do this and they're making all the plans and they're not seeing that followed through. Now they're distressed about it and wanting you to support them. Like that is quite a lot to ask from somebody as well. And I also really want to acknowledge that experience for anybody who might be listening to this and not sure what they can actually do in those situations. But the fixing part, absolutely. There's something very that can feel very invalidating about advice. If you ever meet someone and they mention they're an insomniac, I would say, so what's the first bit of advice that someone always tells you whenever you disclose that? And then, oh, don't get me started. Because the minute you disclose a problem like that, people will say, oh, have you ever tried having a hot bath before you go to bed, or turn your screens off, or whatever it might be?
We love connecting with our listeners, so we host regular community events on Zoom. We also have a private Facebook group for our Patreon supporters. Please visit our website, lifeafterdietspodcast.com, to find out more.
For more details about how to contact us or to work with Sarah or Stef individually, please check out the show notes. Now let's get back to the episode. So I think it's a similar kind of situation there as well. So to be able, like you say, obviously I, as a therapist, appreciate the phrase hold space, but I don't think it's one that people use in everyday lexicon. So what does that actually look like? To hold space for somebody who's going through this and is distressed? What would that be for somebody who's not trained in the way that we are to hold space?
I think there's less to it. It's more eye contact and less talking. When I think of holding space, I think about when I talk to my husband, I think of being embraced or hugged. Even though I would have rejected that too, but it's still just knowing someone is present with me and not necessarily saying that much. Actually, you know what? I do appreciate a good banter. But I think that holding space is allowing me to talk. It's allowing me to pour it out and knowing someone's hearing me, really. But I do like some feedback. I don't know. Holding space for me does involve some feedback.
Actually. That's why it is difficult to do when you haven't practiced it, and it's not that common that I wouldn't say that many people are that natural at holding space when somebody's in pain. I think you want to know that somebody cares that you're hurting, and that somebody just hears that and says, yeah, I hear this is what's going on for you, and I care that you're hurting.
Yeah. And you know what? For me anyway, when people ask questions, I loved when people would ask me questions because it showed a curiosity and a presence of being able to formulate a question that made sense. And it showed me, someone was listening, and it also helped me clarify so much. And it still does. I mean, when people ask me questions, I'm like, oh, let me think about that. Okay, well, here, and it gets this part out. Oh, go ahead. Ask me a question. Go ahead.
What if the question is, why don't you just stop eating so much?
Well, that's not a question.
It's a question.
I mean, a curiosity question. You could frame that differently. You could say, like, what makes it hard about that? Like, why is that hard for you? Or like, what does it feel like to not be able to? Versus I think, when I'm talking questions, I'm from a place of true compassion and curiosity, not judgment and, well, why don't you just, like that's not to me a question.
Yeah. It could be a genuine question. Like, why can't you stop?
Well, that is a question, but why don't you just is not.
Well, why questions they're ones that they really encourage us to move away from when you're in therapy school, because it's just not it also pushes people into their heads, into their analytical so they want you to say more like, tell me more about that, or go on.
Yes. Okay, fine. Well, then that's not a question, but more of a tell me more about that, or go on.
Yeah. It's a way of showing that you care and that you want to know, that I think is helpful. But I suppose, what about when it really conflicts with somebody else's beliefs? Like if they think this is really, really harmful, that concern, again, we briefly touched on it last week, that concern for your health, those kinds of conversations. And if you're going into this non-diet world, I saw it, I can't remember who was writing about it, but they were saying that, if somebody's straight sized or in a smaller body, they say, I'm going non-diet and I'm going to learn to listen to my body and I'm not restricting or controlling. Everyone who knows they've struggled with food stands up and applauds. Well done, you. But anybody then who perhaps might be starting off in a larger body is likely or may end up getting a different reaction. Not always, but there are challenges around sort of challenges beyond our control, i.e. the size of the body that we're starting this journey in, with family going, but this isn't healthy. You can come at them with all the hay stuff, but they can say, I know that you've got arthritis in your knee, and so you losing weight was going to help you be more mobile and do those things that you say you want to do. Like, they know you, so they can catch you out with this stuff.
Yeah. For me, whenever this comes up, I feel like it's really, I'm not going to say this for everybody, but for me, it would be really important to not get pulled into that debate. And I understand why somebody might genuinely have the question. And, that might feel very fair. But if you're in a place of being drawn into a conversation that's going to jeopardize your own sanity, which it often can, I think, in the beginning, to not and to just say, I'm taking my health into consideration and you can trust that I'm covered. I'm working with someone on this and that's handled. I don't need you to worry about that. And leaving it as like keeping it as concise as possible as far as I'm aware and I've got that under control. This is this is my journey and you don't need to worry about that. And just again and again, and that repetition of that is a boundary, really, I think, because even if the other person has a concern that you're like, I do want to explain it, but I know that explaining it jeopardizes me somehow. I think it takes time to be able to enter into conversations about this where you're able to come from a solid place because it can really bring you out. I think that it can rattle you to the point where you can't have a conversation that's sound and where you're speaking from your presence of mind. I think it can really trigger things that cause us to, again, speaking for myself, but it can cause us to sort of like engage in a debate that's much more defensive and it's more panicky. And when you can't speak from a calm place, then that conversation usually is not productive. And so that I think evolves over time.
I've had several clients come through with a similar story to this. So they'll come into therapy, group or individual, and they tell their loved ones, I'm not focusing on the dieting. I need to work on my relationship with food from a therapy perspective. And everyone goes, brilliant. Yes, we know how distressing this has been for you. Go to therapy, go sort it out in therapy. And then a few months later, they're like, so have you done with the therapy thing? Like, when does the weight stuff get managed?
Mhm.
When does it become this? And I think that as well is something about not managing other people's expectations, because I don't think that that's necessarily anyone's job, but how do we handle having those expectations put upon us about what this is supposed to look like? And then the pressure that people feel, well, then they're questioning that maybe I'm doing therapy wrong because these are people I care about and their opinion's important to me. It's that, what if they're right? There might be something worth mentioning in this episode about, for people who don't know about binge eating, what recovery can mean. Because I think there's an idea that someone comes, works on their binge eating, their disordered eating, and then they will be fine. This image of recovery as being a place you get at and now you've fixed everything and it's no longer a problem.
And that it's also not a weight loss and recovery is not a weight loss endeavor. Like we don't measure success in recovery by amount of weight lost, or that's not a marker of being recovered. Um, I think that's relating to this health conversation where there's an
Misconception?
assumption,
Oh,
there's a perception, yeah, that when you're recovered from binge eating, you're thinner.
mhm.
That's what that means. And until then, I think it can be really hard for someone who's in the diet culture system of beliefs as, well, you can't be doing better unless that happens. And so I'm just going to wait for that to happen. And if it's not, then something must be wrong.
Mhm.
So there, I mean, which counters what I just said, because then there is an amount of explanation that feels like it's necessary to be able to explain where you're coming from. I mean, this is very complicated as far as not triggering oneself and also providing yourself with some defense because you really are up against a lot of aggression in the other direction.
I mean, I can sense that pressure even in the here and now, when I tell anybody what I do. I think I've mentioned before, when I first started just working with binge eating, I would still tell people I was an eating disorders therapist. I wouldn't say binge eating, maybe for the first 6 months or so. And then I just started embracing it and taking the word back. But now, when I tell people what I do, I get body checked quite often,
Mm,
and that can feel uncomfortable
mhm,
because I have exactly sometimes that thought. Are they thinking, well, shouldn't she be thinner if she's recovered from binge eating?
mhm.
So I do feel it. And that's not with loved ones, that's just in
Yeah,
the
just
everyday world. But
yeah. Well, I think part of the work in recovery is making peace with what you know and not what others are expecting and needing to defend that so much. And that has come for me with time of really feeling like there's a lot of that doubt in the beginning because I don't know, because it's new. But then over time, to me, it's like this is, I'm sure, like this I'm not binging anymore. So I'm pretty sure that this is a good place for me to be. And I am okay with that. I'm okay with that. And I know you're not. And I know you're thinking you're coming at it from, the perception of that I used to be, we all used to have at one point. But that's not as important to me as my peace of mind here. Um, but it's hard. It's not to say that that's not hard. I do think, though, that it's a nice place to have some sort of centering around that, to combat sort of that pull outward and the pull to sort of want to defend and to understand what the other person's point of view is, because that's what most of the world is potentially thinking. How
Mhm.
much does that matter as far as one's recovery and being able to stand firm there?
Before I did the BBC Radio 1 segment, I put a post out on Instagram asking people the question, what do you wish people knew about binge eating? And the one that came up predominantly in one form or another was, I wish people knew it wasn't a choice. I wish people knew this wasn't about willpower. And I think that is the biggest misconception that maybe your loved ones have, even though they can see how distressing this is for you and that it's not something you want, but that belief or that misconception that there's an element of choice in
Mhm.
this, that if you wanted to enough, you could stop this behavior. That's the part I don't know how to communicate that to people that don't understand. Because I have these conversations with people in all kinds of other settings. And I really am looking for ways to get that message across in a way that can be received. And I don't know if there's a better way of communicating it that I haven't found yet, or whether it's just too much for someone to receive that doesn't have that reference in their mind.
I think the other party, whoever we're talking to around this, I think it's about knowing how open they are to new information and to learning, because there's certainly people in my life who would have been like, yeah, share with me. I don't know anything about this. And, what you tell me is new information to me. And there's other people who didn't want to hear any of that and very much needed to be believing what they believed for their own sake. And so talking to that person wasn't going to go anywhere. And sort of knowing that, I think that having some arsenal of education in your own back pocket, of knowing the effects of weight cycling on health and weight stigma on health, and understanding the way restriction works in our physiological responses, and things like the Minnesota starvation experiment, having some sort of back knowledge of these concepts is helpful to being able to have a conversation with someone who is open to learning things. And I also think it's very tempting to want to talk about all of it really fast and to pour all of this knowledge into someone who's like, whoa, I can only take this in little by little. And so for oneself to have sort of these nuggets of knowledge and to be able to sort of have a slow process of sharing that information with somebody who's there, who's truly supportive and wanting to hear it, so that it's not overwhelming any one person in any one single conversation.
Here's
Yeah.
how I try and share it with Joe Public. Let me know what you think. So
Okay.
what I'll say is something along the lines of, about the appetite being one of the strongest survival drives that we have. So when the system becomes dysregulated or goes awry, in those moments with an out of control appetite, it can honestly feel like life or death.
Mhm.
And that's kind of the closest in terms of some kind of other language to try and explain what that feels like in the moment when you want to binge and nothing else matters. Nothing. Doesn't matter if your partner's going to be upset with you. Doesn't matter if you promised to yourself that you were going to do X, Y, Z. Doesn't matter if you know that it's harming your health. In that moment, it doesn't matter. That's the part that doesn't make rational sense when you're not in it. When you're not in it, it doesn't make rational sense,
Yeah.
but you don't care about what's rational in the moment. All you care about is binging. And that, I don't know if there's anyone listening to this who's listening to this episode because they don't know about binge eating, that could tell me if that even makes sense or helps to create any kind of understanding or appreciation of what it feels like.
Yeah. Yeah, my version of that is to talk about that binging comes from a different part of the brain outside of conscious control. Like that those urges and impulses are actually coming from like the I mean, or a primal part of our brain. And it's not something that is housed in rational thought. And so just that knowledge, I mean, for me, even that was a really important understanding for me to have it explained so much in my own mind of like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's exactly what it feels like. And I think other people might be able to understand that, from that point of view of this, oh, okay, those signals are happening in a more subconscious part of the brain. I think that's helpful. I also think when we're talking about the choice to not diet anymore, to not value body weight as much anymore, even, I think just sometimes a simple explanation of I'm choosing not to focus on losing weight anymore. I'm choosing to heal my relationship with food right now and not focus on diets. Like just sort of saying, just having the feeling like you're free to not even necessarily explain why it makes sense or it's just your choice. I'm choosing not to. It's been a burden to me for a long time, and I'm choosing to go at life another way. No one's responsible for making that okay with anyone else. It's simply you're just stating your choice. This isn't something I'm focusing on anymore. I've talked about it before, and just that sometimes I think when there is a desire to speak to somebody about this, that I've thrown out the option of writing a letter or an email rather than saying it in person, because it's a way of kind of collecting and organizing thoughts without having to necessarily do that live, where our nerves might take over and we might forget to say something we wanted to say, or just sort of the tone of a written form is different than engaging in something that might become a more heated debate or something like that. And that's an option.
Yeah. And it gives the other person a chance to absorb what's probably is a lot of information, and they can have their reaction, and then they can have their more absorbed reaction later on. And another thing that I just want to mention is I'll often ask people when we're talking about this kind of thing, I say, what is it that you want from this other person? Like, how do you want them to respond in this moment? And sometimes they'll say, well, I don't actually know. And I'll point out, if you don't know, how on earth is the other person going to know what the right thing to say or do is? So I would encourage anybody, if they're going to be having these conversations, to really spend some time thinking about what is the outcome of this conversation that I really want? Can I be very clear about what's helpful to me? And to express it as such. So if you want to put in boundaries about talking about certain things, for example, to say, this would really support me if you would do this, or if you would stop doing this. And I would really appreciate that so much from you, as opposed to, you need to stop doing this because I don't like it. Because if people know that by not doing something, and this is someone who cares about you, they know that that is actually helping. Because a lot of the time, the things they're doing that's not helpful is them trying to help. And it does put some people sometimes, and I can really relate to this response, there's a bit of I don't want to have to be the one to figure it out.
Yeah.
I don't want that responsibility. I want someone else to come along and make it better. And I think that's really human, and that's okay. And be gentle with yourself about that. And then take responsibility for it in a self-loving way.
And then
get over yourself. Okay. So we can wrap that up. I think that's good enough.
Yeah. All right.
If you want to know more about any of our live events, please check the link below. You can come and join us on Patreon/Life After Diets, where you can join our private Facebook group, where we are in there active, interacting with everybody there. And of course, the usual ratings and stuff. Reviews.
We appreciate your reviews very, very much.
And if you think we're nice ladies and we're worth a listen, then please tell us so on your podcast app and follow the show.
Bye. Bye.
It was a bit breathy.
This microphone is very fun.
It is. It's got a lovely sort of bass to it, Or it's just your voice has got a lovely bass to it.